Bueno, vamos a poner a grabar. Bienvenidas y bienvenidos a este espacio. Estamos muy contentos desde el capítulo de la ACBS Colombia. Hoy tenemos a una invitada muy especial. Staci Martin es una colega, una psicóloga que ya voy a leer su perfil profesional, que es muy amplio. Ella nos va a dar su exposición en inglés. No obstante, cuando tengamos las preguntas, quien hable inglés fluido puede hacerlas, si no, yo me encargo de hacer las traducciones. ¿Listo? Entonces, Stacy es psicóloga clínica y entrenadora ACT, con revisión por pares, especializada en ACT para niños y adultos con problemas de salud. Actualmente preside el subcomité plenario del Comité de Estrategia de la Conferencia de la ACBS y es editora asociada del Journal of Contextual Behavioral Science. Es autora de más de 80 publicaciones en revistas con revisión por pares. También es científica asociada senior de la División de Oncología Pediátrica del Instituto Nacional de Cáncer y directora clínica del Programa de Investigación en Psicología de la Salud y Neuroconductual. Investigación se centra en intervenciones de ACT para población infantil, también para adultos y sobre todo a nivel de salud, anemia de células falciformes, cáncer y síndromes de predisposición a la enfermedad oncológica. Acá nos podríamos quedar ahondando más en toda su experiencia, pero bueno, hoy puntualmente nos va a hablar de la optimización del funcionamiento en personas con dolor crónico, pues basado en ACT, el modelo de terapia de aceptación y compromiso. Thank you very much, Stacey, for being here with us, for joining
Pleasure.
today our
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Please, anytime. I already introduced you in Spanish, gave some of your CV information. Of course, you have done plenty of things, and that's why we're here today. Also, reminding everyone that we're doing this master class in order to be able to see what you're doing and a little bit of your experience, which we'll have the chance to have as well in Colombia in the conference. So everyone can actually get to know you a little bit and have a little taste of this training that you actually do with other colleagues and the work that you do with plenty of clients in the United States. Okay, so a pleasure for us, and please, whenever you're ready.
Okay. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to coming to Colombia as well. So let me share my screen. Okay. Do you see the correct view?
All set. Perfect.
Okay, great. So thanks for the introduction, and I'm really excited to be here talking about one of my favorite subjects. I have been working with medical patients with chronic pain for over 20 years in various capacities. And when I learned about ACT, I was very excited about it. I felt like right away, this is what I need to be doing with these individuals. And so I have. So I will talk a little bit at first about the impact of pain. I'll talk briefly about some of the research support for ACT with chronic pain. We'll get into a little bit of functional analysis, and then we will talk about identifying the behaviors to target as therapists, and then we'll talk about some interventions. So I want to note at first that 10 to 25% of people around the world endorse chronic pain. And my guess is that it's at the higher end of that range. And chronic pain is defined as lasting for 3 months or more. Back in 2019, a group of people got together. They were researchers, clinicians, physicians, other healthcare workers, hospitals, administrators, and they invited people with chronic pain to this meeting to talk about the problem of chronic pain and how we could go about, alleviating that difficulty for people. And so they published this online book called Voice of the Patient. And when I read it, I was so struck by some of the quotes from people that were there with chronic pain sharing their experience. And so I wanted to share a few of them with you. And these first couple of quotes really impress upon how pain can impact people's emotional well-being. This pain has pushed me to my breaking point. One night in the car, my mind was so overwhelmed with that pain, I reached up and tried opening my door so I could jump out of the car. This was not a suicide attempt, it was an overwhelming thought. My pain is so severe, my mind thought the only way to cope with it was to slam my body on a hard surface at 65 miles per hour. So if you can just think for a second about how desperate a person would have to be to have thoughts like this, right? How severe the pain must be. Another person said, a good day is a day I do not research assisted suicide or look into moving to a state that has legalized suicide for chronically ill patients. Pain also, of course, has an impact on people's social relationships. One person said, I am in constant fear of anything touching me, like people who are huggers or waitresses who like to pat you on the shoulder. Another person said, my son didn't put me down as an emergency contact because he knows I can't be there for him. And then another person said, my extended family and some friends believe I'm just addicted to pain medication and not actually sick because it said so on the news. People are getting all kinds of misinformation. And finally, friends and family no longer come around because it's too hard to see me hurting. So all of these illustrate how people become withdrawn from their support networks, from people that they care about because of chronic pain. Pain also has an impact on people's identity. And I think most people listening to this are familiar with the ACT model. And so if you think about the concept of self as context here or content, that's a good frame, I think, to listen to these quotes in. I went from being a mom, wife, and an executive at the peak of my career to spending nearly every moment in the daybed in my family room. And I used to be a massage therapist. Now I can barely rub lotion on my own hands. So again, just seeing how these people's lives are shrinking. And then finally, pain, of course, impacts treatment concerns. I don't know about the legality in Colombia or South America related to prescribing opioids, And I'm happy to have someone share that with me in a moment. But a couple of quotes related to that are, opioids have been the one consistent medication that has no side effects and allows me to live my life in a productive manner. Now, we know that not everyone that takes opioids has no side effects, but for some people, it is really, really helpful. And then, related to that, another person said, my doctor said I was not worth her losing her license over, so she started weaning me off my pain meds where I had been stable, which resulted in my attempting suicide because the pain was so unbearable. So, if we can get ourselves behind the eyes of some of these individuals, imagine what it's like living day by day and moment by moment in their lives. In terms of the research support, I did a search on PubMed to look for ACT and chronic pain publications. I looked for 2010 to 2011, and there were 6. 2020 to 2021, so 1 decade later, there were 33. And then from 2023 to 2024, there were 69. So these are growing exponentially, and these are some of the journals where you'll find some of those studies. Now, the ACBS journal, Journal of Contextual Behavioral Science, or JCBS, it's not indexed in PubMed, so a lot of times those articles from JCBS don't show up in this search. So I did a separate search for JCBS, and to date there are 254 publications on chronic pain. So, and most of these studies are supporting the efficacy of ACT in chronic pain, most of the intervention studies. Because of all of the research support, the World Health Organization has recommended ACT for the management of chronic pain in children. As another example, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence recommends ACT and CBT for adults with chronic pain. And that brings us to a functional analysis. And I think this is such an important part of the treatment approach when you're working with people with chronic pain, when you're working with pretty much anyone from an ACT perspective, as many of you know. But we have to remember that our roots are in behaviorism, right? Behavior analysis, functional analysis. And so let's take a moment and go back to those roots. So many of you are probably familiar with what we call the ABCs of behavior. I don't know if it uses the same letters in Spanish, but in America and in English, we talk about the antecedent. So what is happening in the background? What is happening for that person in the present? And that's part of the context, right? Learning about the context. And the antecedent leads to a behavior, right? And that behavior leads to a consequence or a function. So let's talk about an example. Oh, okay, right. So I'll do that in a second. I forgot we had one more slide in between. And so when you think about that ABC, antecedent, behavior, consequence, it doesn't just stop at the consequence, right? It goes on. And so whatever happens with that consequence or function then leads to another behavior and another consequence and another antecedent and another consequence and so forth. And so you could go on and on and on trying to break this down for any individual client that you're working with. So you have to kind of choose where you want to intervene, right? Every behavior has more than one antecedent. Every behavior has more than one consequence, and every unit of behavior can be broken down into smaller parts, and that's what we're going to do. So you can decide based on clinical judgment and what's happening with that individual, whether to intervene here or here or here or anywhere else along that behavioral stream. So now we're going to consider an example with this in mind. Let's say that you're working with someone who says that when they wake up and they're in pain, they decide to stay home in bed. And then they feel immediate relief because they don't have to go into work or go do any of the things that they had planned that day. So the antecedent or the context is waking up in pain. And sometimes people will say, well, if I wake up and my pain is above a 5 or a 7 on the 0 to 10 pain scale, then I stay home in bed. And then that immediate feeling of relief comes because it's like, oh, good, I get to stay home. I don't have to worry about doing any of that stuff. But let's look at that in a little bit more detail. So here's the consequence. Let's take that consequence and move further along the behavioral stream from there. So we're going to move that to the next antecedent, part of the context then. They're feeling that immediate relief. And then there's the possibility that the behavior that comes next, and in behavior, I'm including verbal behavior, thoughts, and feelings, right? As is consistent with contextual behavioral science and ACT. Let's say the person starts getting bored and thinking, oh God, another day in bed. They might have some anxiety about missing work. And then they might start to have some self-critical thoughts like, why didn't I just get up and rough it out, right? Why did I have to stay in bed? I shouldn't have done that. I'm too lazy. I feel guilty. And then the consequence of that, or the function of those thoughts, can end up with a more significant depression and anxiety. So let's look more at the antecedent again, because that's a little bit simple to just say the antecedent is feeling that immediate relief. So the antecedent could be partly, yes, they wake up in pain. But what I would want to know as their therapist is, what is that person's current work environment? Because they're saying they're going to miss work that day to stay home in bed. And I want to know how do their colleagues and their supervisors feel about them when they stay home in pain? Do they know about their medical condition? Are they caring and understanding, or is it leading to some problems? I want to know that as part of the context. I, of course, would want to know about the medical history. What is the condition that is causing their pain? Because I might treat that different if it's someone who has, chronic back pain versus cancer pain, right? That's a different context. So I want to know about that. And then we have to consider the treatment recommendations. What does the person's medical team say about what they should do when they wake up in pain? Do they suggest not staying in bed because they need to move their body to help with the pain? Or do they say, don't overdo it. If your pain is above a certain level, you should stay home and you should rest. We don't necessarily know that. So I want to ask about that. And then the past behavior of this person, their learning history. So at times when they have stayed home from work in the past and stayed in bed all day because of their pain, what has happened in the past? What were the consequences? How did that function? What have they learned about how that functions for them? And depending on all of those factors and more, you could add more to the context. Then one option is to stay home in bed, but there are other options when we consider that context, and we want to help our clients understand those other options and look at what they are. And then we can get a better idea of what the consequences of each of those options, each of those behaviors might be. How would each of those behaviors function? We can't always predict accurately, but we can usually make some good guesses. And so the other things that I would want to know as part of the context is to add to what we've already said. They might be fused with rules about their pain. So that thought that if my pain is above a 7, I can't go to work. That could be a rule that they are fused with. And they could be very inflexible about that, right? So I'd want to assess their fusion with those types of thoughts and rules. They might demonstrate a lot of avoidance of painful activities or activities that may end up causing pain, even if those activities are in line with their values. So I want to know about their avoidance. I work with a lot of people who want to control their pain, and they try very hard to control their pain. And so their level of acceptance with pain is pretty low. They're constantly trying to, put time and effort into getting rid of their pain. Other people might just try not to think about their pain, right? Just try to ignore it, try to distract themselves from it. And that person may be low in terms of present moment awareness or mindfulness. And then we talked about identities and how people can be fused with identities about their pain. So the person could be, in terms of self as context or content, they might be overly or inflexibly identifying with that label of pain patient or something similar. So I want to look at all of those kinds of things. I want to look at, that's pretty much most of what we're talking about with ACT, right? With the hexaflex and the open, aware, engaged version of the ACT core constructs. And so once we figure out, oh, there's a lot of fusion there, or they're just avoiding all of the time, whatever it is, that will lead us to some interventions, how we can then intervene. So as a first example, let's think about a person who tries to control their pain and is very low in acceptance. So when I was pregnant with my first child many years ago, I went to a childbirth class, and the leader of the class passed around ice cubes to everyone, all of the women, and said, just hold this for as long as you can. And I remember stressing out pretty quickly about that because I was having all of these thoughts like, oh my God, this is painful. Oh, I really don't like this. I can't do this. When am I going to be allowed to drop this and let go of it? So that was my experience. And then the teacher said, okay, in a minute, I'm going to give you another ice cube. But this time, I want you to look at the ice cube. I want you to notice how it feels. Be curious about the sensations. Keep breathing. And look at it from that reference. And I remember very clearly being able to hold the ice cube a lot longer. And there are a lot of research studies that show that that's the case as well. So I think of that a lot when I work with people, because that is an option. If you're seeing the person in person and you have access to a block of ice, an ice cube, then that's a possible intervention. I think of a lot of acceptance and willingness interventions as exposure. So just like the example I just gave with the ice cube, we were exposed to the sensation, the uncomfortable sensation, and we had to practice how we approached that. So how long can the person hold an ice cube? And I have my patients do this, try it once while saying stressful thoughts, and then again saying mindful acceptance and curiosity thoughts. If there's no ice, I sometimes just have people hold their arm right out in front of them or out to the side because that can become pretty uncomfortable after the first 10-15 seconds. Another thing I've done is to have people write the word pain or an associated word, whatever, dolor, whatever word they want to use, on a piece of paper, and then see if they can hold that piece of paper gently in their palms. See if they can look at that piece of paper and send compassion to it. If you ever do group therapy, this is a great exercise in a group because you can have people write their word on a piece of paper and then exchange it with someone else. And so if I'm in that group, I'm holding someone else's pain. And can I hold their pain with compassion and empathy? And what is it like to know that the person across from me is holding my pain with compassion and empathy? You could also play around with that piece of paper. Can you add other words to it besides pain? Can you add an image that you like, that you find beautiful, or an image representing compassion? And then there is an exercise that's called the expansion exercise. I think that's the name of it. That's what I call it. I didn't make this up. But that's something where I'd actually like to encourage people who are listening to this to do this along with me. And so if you're willing, you can close your eyes or get comfortable in your chair. Just look down if you'd rather not close your eyes, that's fine. And scan your body to notice if you have any pain present in this moment. If you don't, then try to imagine the last time you were in pain or a place in your body that you often have pain. Notice where it is. And then imagine drawing a line around that pain. Visualize what that would look like, kind of the outline of the pain. Notice the shape of the pain. Notice how big or small. And then as you continue breathing, imagine breathing into and around that pain, gently and with compassion. And then finally, imagine opening up to that pain and letting it flow freely wherever it wants to go, just for a few seconds. And just notice with curiosity what it does. Now that you're not constraining it, what happens? So that's the end of the exercise. If you were doing that along with me, you can open your eyes and come back to the slides and the presentation. And it's an interesting exercise, I think, because some people with chronic pain will tell me afterwards, I didn't like that. They'll say, I had to focus on my pain, and I'm so used to ignoring my pain or trying to control my pain. And that's okay, because that's exposure. And you're trying to add some compassion to the exposure and to the pain. And I will also say it's good to be able to take advantage of pain that the person is having in session. One of the populations that I work with are people who tested positive for the gene that causes stomach cancer. And many of these individuals choose to have a surgery where their entire stomach is removed. And so basically the doctors go in and they take out the stomach and they connect the tubes around another way. And so these people have to learn how to eat again, essentially. And so They can also experience a lot of discomfort around eating. They can experience nausea and vomiting. They can experience uh, reflux. It can be very uncomfortable going down. And I was working with one of these people a while back, a really wonderful woman in her 50s who had had this surgery. And she came to session one day and said, I'm just in a lot of pain. I don't know if I'm going to be able to concentrate today. And so we did that exercise that I just did with all of you. And what she said afterwards was, wow, I really noticed that the pain wasn't everywhere. It felt like it was everywhere at first, but it's really just here in this one spot. And it let her really cope with that pain differently and in a way that was not so uncomfortable emotionally or physically. So that's one example. If someone has stomach pain, another example is to have them bring food. Well, that's what I did with this person, is to have them bring food to that session and eat it while we were together. So any way that you can kind of think of an exposure exercise, I think those are really helpful. Moving into present moment awareness or mindfulness, you know, mindfulness is kind of this umbrella, and one of the components of it is present moment awareness, as many of you probably know. And when I'm doing present moment or mindfulness exercises with the patients that I work with, um, I might want to shift how I go about doing them for people with chronic pain, right? So body scans can be really helpful. I don't necessarily do that the first session or the first couple of sessions, because a body scan is essentially combining um, mindfulness with acceptance and exposure. And so, just going through the entire body slowly with the individual, where they just notice the sensations. I typically start with the right foot. What do you notice? Temperature. Do you notice tension or relaxation? And kind of going through the entire body. There are also apps and audio meditations of body scans that you can find online as well. I also like mindful movement a lot, because many of the people that I work with, they can't do yoga very well, or any kind of exercise that is more where they have to exert themselves. And so for mindful movement, I really like, this is from Thich Nhat Hanh's Mindful Movements, and there are videos on this on YouTube if anyone wants to search. If you search Thich Nhat Hanh down at the bottom of the slide and 10 mindful movements, you will see these. And they're very simple. People can do them when they're in pain usually. They can do them when they're in a wheelchair or when they're in bed, some of them. And so the really simple ones start out with, your hands down at your side or in your lap, and just raise your arms up straight out in front of you while you inhale slowly. And then as you exhale, slowly lower your hands back down. So you can see there are some of the other mindful movements that can be done. There's also Tai Chi is pretty gentle as well. So you can find some very gentle Tai Chi stretches that can be done. And this is also something that people can do to practice mindfulness if they really don't like to do mindful breathing in and of itself, or just quiet, silent meditation. And mindful walking, taking a walk noticing the sensations and what you see and smell and hear on the walk. It can be just a 5-minute walk. For some of the people that I work with who are in the hospital, I actually invite them to walk around the unit, even if they have to carry their IV pole with them. Obviously, I make sure that that's okay with the nurses and the medical team before I would ask them to do that. Um, but that can be helpful as well, just noticing what you notice along that walk. And again, all of these are exposure. Alexandra, are there any questions, or should I stop for questions, or should I just go through all the way to the end now, do you think?
Usually we leave 10 minutes, at the
At
end
the
of
end.
the master class. But if you
Great.
want me to ask other people,
That's
it,
just, I can't see the chat, so I didn't know if anyone had written
I'll
anything in
let
the
you
chat.
know. No worries. Okay.
Okay, great. Thanks. So let's get into values now. And values are an essential part of working with people with chronic pain, because why would someone agree to actually notice their pain on purpose? Why would they agree to experience pain, or do things that they knew were going to cause pain, except if it was related to something important to them, right? And so there's a wonderful ACT psychologist named Lisa Coyne that some of you may have heard of and some of you may know. I remember her giving this example at a workshop that she did years ago, and I stole it from her. And so the exercises, and it works really well if you're in person at a training, but if you can imagine that I have a pencil with a very sharp lead, and if I asked you to hold your hand out in front of me and then let me stab you in the hand with the pencil as hard as you could. Or if you're by yourself, imagine me asking you to pick up a pencil or something sharp and stab yourself with it. So if I asked people to let me stab them with a pencil or to stab themselves with a pencil, not very many people would agree to that, right? And so let me ask another question. And this is kind of I'm going to ask you to suspend reality right now and work with me on this hypothetical question, which is, if you knew that this pencil was a magic pencil, and if you stabbed yourself in the hand with the pencil, cancer would be cured all over the world. No more cancer. And the question is, if that were true, would you let someone stab you in the hand with a pencil? And usually, overwhelmingly, the answer is yes. And notice how quickly your perspective on that might have shifted there, right? You were so unwilling to do it, and then most people find, okay, yeah, if it's related to something I care about, something important, then I would be willing to experience that pain. I want to mention a really cool study that was done back in 2019. You might recognize a lot of those names of the authors. And it was a really interesting study. They looked at values and how they relate to people's pain tolerance. So essentially, they had people come in and put their hand in ice water, and they timed how long people could leave their hand in. They said, leave your hand in as long as you can. And then when they took their hands out, they then divided people into two groups. There was a values condition, and for those individuals, they asked them to complete a worksheet and visualize and clarify their personal values, and then to relate those values to the cold presser task, kind of like what we just did with the pencil. The other group was randomized to a control condition where they just read some neutral material for the same amount of time. And so what they found was that the groups were pretty much the same the first time they held their hand in the cold water. But after that intervention, look at how much longer the values group increased the time that they kept their hand in cold water, whereas the control group was essentially the same, even a little bit lower. So that's really powerful in my mind. That just emphasizes the importance of working with people's values in this type of therapy. So, a nice quote, this is by a physician, but I think it applies just as much to us. We've been wrong about what our job is in medicine. We think our job is to ensure health and survival, but really it's larger than that. It's to enable well-being. And well-being is about the reasons one wishes to be alive. In other words, values, right? And he goes on to say, those reasons matter not just at the end of our life or when disability comes, but all along the way. This is another values exercise that I do with some of my patients. And I will actually do this either on a computer screen if I'm seeing them for telehealth or in person on a piece of paper. So if you imagine that this red circle represents your pain, and then imagine that there are all of these other circles on the outside that represent your values. So you would get the person to tell me, what are the things that are important to you? So they tell me about these things. And a lot of times when I ask them further about these values, they would say, I don't really do that anymore. I used to volunteer at an animal shelter, but I don't do that anymore because of my pain. Or I don't really have as many friends anymore because I don't go out because of my pain, and so forth. Now, the other option, what I would draw next, is something more like this. Their pain is exactly the same, but what I want for my patients is to have them really expand their connection with their values, right? How can you be more willing to start working with animals again, or to spend some time with your friends socially again, and with all these other things that you care about? Let's increase your connection with all of these values, right? These are the values that that person has named, and you're not minimizing the pain, you're just helping them to increase their values, and not all at once, right? I would not go from the left to the right in a week, right? It takes time to build those up. But the question becomes, which one do you want your life to look like? I can't take away your pain. And most likely, if you're coming to me for therapy with chronic pain, the doctors aren't able to remove your pain, at least not completely. So you have it, and we don't have a choice about that. But you do have a choice about which of these images you want to try to reach. And then what if we even aimed for something like that, where the pain was still there, but it really was kind of off in the periphery now, and your life was just so full of connections with values? And one of the ways that you can kind of tell if someone is there, if they've gotten to this point, is when they show up to a session with you and they don't mention their pain, right? Instead, they're talking about how they got into an argument with one of their friends at school, or they're applying for a new job, or they're stressed about some big thing going on at work or with their family, but they don't mention the pain. That's what I love, right? They just have normal problems. And so we try to help them with those. When we're talking about actually moving forward, getting from that other one picture with the tiny little values to the one with the big value circles, we're talking about committed action. And I want to know what is going to get in the way, right? What are the potential barriers? Potential barriers, actual barriers that you encounter when you are trying to increase your connection with some of those values. Want to raise the question again, are you willing to experience pain in the service of a value? And sometimes I'll do something like a swamp metaphor, which many of you may be familiar with. I kind of put a little different twist on it where I have the person imagine that they're trudging through the jungle and they see their value up ahead and they really want to move towards it. But there's this swamp in front of them and there's no way around it. It's muddy, it's cold, there are bugs. It's very, very disgusting. And so we have to ask, are you willing to experience pain in the service of that value? Are you willing to trudge through the swamp to get to that value? And the part where I kind of put my own twist on it is I'll first have them imagine you're standing right in front of that swamp. Now imagine turning around and walking the other way, away from the swamp and away from the value. And just notice what that feels like. What comes up for you when you're imagining walking away? And sometimes I'm kind of relieved that I don't have to go through the swamp. And then there's also usually something of, I'm just moving farther from my values and I don't like that feeling. And then I have them turn around and walk back to the swamp and imagine what it's like lifting your foot and taking that first step. And what does that feel like? And oftentimes they'll say, well, it feels gross, right? I don't particularly like the feeling of being all muddy and wet. And what else do you notice? Do you notice anything about how it feels to get closer every step of the way to your value? And then when I'm using this as an example, and I will tell people, for example, a young woman that I worked with a while back with chronic pain was telling me about a march that she went to, like a rally where a lot of people were coming together and they had poster boards and they were, rallying for something important. I think it might have been for women's rights or something like that. And she said to me, the next day, I was so sore. I just stayed in bed most of the day. I couldn't really do much. And I just don't know if I did the right thing. How do I know if I did the right thing? And what I ended up saying to her or asking her was it worth it? If you could go back in time, would you go to the march again? And when I asked her that, she said, with no delay, she said, oh, yes, absolutely, in a heartbeat. And I said, well, I think that's your answer, right? It sounds like it was worth it to you. You were willing to experience that pain the next day because that was so important to you. And there may be times when the person says, I don't think it was worth it, right? If I had to do it over again, I wouldn't do it. And that's important information. That's important data. That's part of that context, right? The function of that behavior and so on and so on. And sometimes people are still unwilling or hesitant to do that behavior. And they say, well, that march is coming up again next month and I'm not sure if I should go because I know I'm going to be in a lot of pain the next day. And it's really important to me. So there are the two sides. And then four other words. Was it worth it? Are the most important, one of the four of the most important words that I ask. And then the other four important words are, you get to choose. You're right, you might be in more pain. You're right. And it sounds like this is really important to you. So I don't know, let's think about both of those options and you get to choose. It's not my choice, it's your choice. And so all the other kind of barriers, well, I'm just not in the mood to do this. I just get distracted when I try to do this, or I'm just in too much pain. But a really cool quote is commitment means staying loyal to what you said you were going to do long after the mood you said it in has left you. So what are you going to do if you wake up the morning of that march and you just don't feel like it? You're not in the mood. Or what do you do if you're in pain that day? You get to choose. And sometimes the most functional behavior could be staying home and resting. Sometimes it could be going to the march, right? It's their choice. And if you do wake up and you're not in the mood or you're in pain, I'll say, whatever choice you make that morning, don't let the pain make that decision for you. Let your values make that decision for you. And that value may be the meaning behind that march that you're going to, women's rights or whatever, or the value that you most need to attend to that day might be self-care, right? Staying home and resting. And again, they get to choose. I don't know what the right answer is for them, right? They know that. And they could be equally valid choices. So kind of the last part of what I'll talk about is going back to what we said before, where we had that example of the person waking up in pain, and we talked about a lot of the other contextual factors that were there. The first thing they might choose is to stay home in bed, right? And that is one option. But what we can help people do is say, okay, well, what other options do you have? And which of these options are related to a value? Right? So you don't want to go to work today. Maybe the value is actually doing well at my job because there's a presentation I have to make today, and it would not be good if I missed it. Or I have, I can work from home. That's another option, and that might be fine, right? Depending on the context. Or maybe I work for half a day or whatever else you need to do, right? Stay home and rest for 2 hours and then go into the office. There's all those different options. And which one you choose, I want it to be linked to a value, right? So what happens if you choose something else? Let's experiment with some of those other options of behaviors. And then you have lots of other consequences, lots of going back and looking at how each of those options functioned and whether it worked for the person. So I'm going to stop here as I show you a picture of my values. And I will stop sharing my screen. There we go.
Thank you so much, Stacy, for this great, great, great presentation. ¿Alguien tiene preguntas? Dayana, Valentina, Kenji, ¿tendrían alguna pregunta o comentario? Me lo pueden escribir en el chat si quieren. Si hablan inglés, pues también se la pueden hacer a Stacy directamente.
Yo te iba a decir, Alexandra, bueno, buenas tardes. Ahí logré captar como alguna información del mensaje. Muchísimas gracias. No sé si de ser posible nos pueden compartir la presentación como para interiorizarla con más calmita y poder revisarla con tiempo,
Ujú.
pero muchísimas gracias.
Okay, claro que sí. Diana is saying that she's very pleased to be here, and if there's any chance to have the PowerPoint presentation so they can check it.
Yeah, that's a great point. I would be happy to send the slides to Alexandra and then you can share them.
Perfect, thank you. Listo, ella me las va a mandar a mí, Dayana, y si quieres me escribes por Instagram ahí en el DM para mandártelas a tu correo, ¿vale? Y a quien sea que esté interesado. ¿Alguna
Vale,
otra
mil gracias.
pregunta? Con gusto. Ok, claro que sí. Sí, me escriben si quieren nos escriben para nosotros tener sus correos y les mandamos la presentación. ¿Tendrían alguna pregunta, inquietud de lo que hoy revisamos? Un poco desde lo que son valores, análisis funcional, conducta comprometida, un poco Stacy fue por todos los puntos del Hexaflex. ¿Alguno de ustedes tendría alguna pregunta? Y aprovechamos que ya está acá.
A mí me gustaría saber, bueno, hay mucha investigación claramente de que ACT y ejercicios de atención plena y mindfulness son súper efectivos para, digamos que sobrellevar, incluso aliviar el dolor crónico en pacientes como por ejemplo cáncer, ¿cierto? Pero sí me gustaría saber cómo qué ejercicios de pronto nos recomiendan de pronto en población hospitalaria, en población que tiene ya de por sí dolores crónicos ya de base, que ni siquiera la medicina, ni siquiera los tratamientos ambulatorios pues logran subsanar, ¿no? Entonces, desde a qué podríamos hacer como para apoyar a esos pacientes.
Muy buena pregunta. So Diana wants to ask you about the work that can be done with hospitalized patients, like these people that, okay, there's tons of research regarding chronic pain and
Mhm.
logical pain, cancer patients and ACT, but what about those who probably they don't have a cancer diagnosis, but how can we work with them because they have also probably
Yeah,
other, chronic diseases, but
yeah,
specifically chronic pain diagnosis, and they're hospitalized and they don't have many options.
yeah. That's a great question, Diana. Muchas gracias. So one of the other populations that I work with is people with sickle cell disease, and they have a lot of chronic pain often. And so um, I think that a lot of what I was talking about does apply with them. You just might have to modify things a little bit. For example, they may not be able to connect with as many of their values in the same way, right? If they're in the hospital, they may not be able to visit with friends as much or, have friends come visit on occasion, but really not connecting with their friends or family as much as they would want to. Um, other things that they just can't do while they're in the hospital. And so I try to be creative there and say, you're missing your friends or your family. What can you do? What's another way to connect with this value? Um, while acknowledging that, oh my gosh, you really want to go out with your friends this weekend. They're having a party and you really want to be there. Or there's some important thing that's happening with your kid that you really want to be there for and you can't because you're in the hospital. What are other ways of connecting with that? Can you can you have a video chat, a Zoom chat, or a phone call with your friends? Um, what are other ways that you can connect with some of those values? Um, I also ask them about values such as, personal traits, how they want to show up. For example, I have a lot of people when they're hospitalized that say, I'm just in so much pain. I really snapped at the nurses today and I don't even care. I just was hurting so much and I didn't want to get out of bed, but they were making me get out of bed, all kinds of things like that, right? And so I might say, well, how do you want to show up? Because I know the nurses are going to come in later or tomorrow and they're going to say something else that's probably going to annoy you or increase your pain. When that happens again, how do you want to show up? Right? And they might say, I can't even think about doing it another way right now. And then it might just be something like, but I will tell the nurses thank you, and I will let them know when I'm in less pain that I'm sorry if I was short with them. I should stop and let you get, do you want to translate that, or is it okay what I just said?
Dayana, ¿entendiste parte de esto? ¿Quieres que traduzca?
Si podrías, por favor,
Claro
traducirme
que sí. Let me
mejor.
just go ahead
Gracias.
and translate. So, Stacy nos comenta que ella también tiene, por supuesto, pacientes que están hospitalizados y que tienen momentos muy difíciles porque al estar hospitalizados quizás ya no puedan ver a los amigos, salir, estar con la familia, etcétera. Y para esto, digamos que ya propone dos cosas. La primera, la creatividad, ¿no? Como de qué otras formas podríamos encontrar con esos consultantes de conectar con los valores, con lo que es importante. Entonces, si usualmente antes salíamos a las fiestas, ¿sabes? Ahora es como podemos hacer una llamada por Zoom o podemos hacer, no sé, mandarnos cartas, como encontrar otras formas en que nos acerquen a eso que es importante, ¿sí? Y esa creatividad, digamos que nosotros como terapeutas la fomentamos, la modelamos a nuestros consultantes. La otra, daba un ejemplo de, por ejemplo, un paciente que tiene mucho dolor y termina gritándole a la enfermera. Entonces, que podemos ahí decirles, bueno, ¿y cómo quieres tú, cuando ya dices show up, es estar presente? ¿Cómo te quieres mostrar ante las otras personas en cuanto a estar ahí y estar de la forma que para uno no es como relevante? Entonces, en ese ejemplo que ella daba, pudiera ser de decirle a la enfermera que lo siento, si le grité o la traté mal, esa puede ser una. O también decirle, ¿sabes qué? Me mejoró un poco cuando me pusiste el medicamento, me mejoré un tanto, lo agradezco. Son como esas pequeñas cosas que pueden acercar a los consultantes a ellos como quisieran, ¿sabes? Ser, que aún estando con el dolor, es como mostrar y ser la mejor versión posible de uno, aún en esa condición. Y bueno, estos son algunos ejemplos de formas en cómo podemos ayudarle a estos consultantes. ¿Fui clara, Dayana?
Sí, Alexandra, mil gracias. Ya me contextualizó mucho más la idea en la cabeza.
Perfecto. This was this worked for her, for Diana to understand, Stacy, with the
Okay,
examples and everything
great. Oh,
regarding
good.
creativity and how you show up as a client when you're struggling with your pain and probably the
Yeah,
nurses or whatever else.
yeah, yeah, good. Okay, thank you for the question. Muchas gracias por la pregunta, Diana.
Muy bien. ¿Tendrían alguna otra, Kenji o Dayana, alguna otra pregunta? Vale. Gracias a todos por venir. Thank you very, very much, Stacy. This was great. Hopefully, we could see each other in Colombia in our first regional Latin American conference. Uh,
Yes, yes, yes. That sounds wonderful. Thank you again for inviting me, Alex. I really enjoyed it.
no, thank you. Y Dayana y Kenji, no se pierdan que tenemos este gran evento. Haremos un intensivo junto con la Universidad de los Andes y bueno, todo el capítulo de la ICBS de Colombia. Estamos haciendo el 2 y el 3 de octubre un intensivo en FAP y conferencia con muchos invitados, tanto nacionales como internacionales. Stacy es una de las invitadas para enseñarnos en un taller intensivo estas herramientas de la terapia ACT en pacientes con dolor crónico. Entonces, no se lo pierdan, tenemos toda la información en las redes sociales. Gracias por participar y por sus preguntas. Stacy, see you soon.
Okay,
Venga,
sounds good.
ok.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Chao.
Bye,
Adiós.
thank you.